Hey, hi, how you going? It's your mate Valstride, and today we're doing the first of our 4 upgrade guides. So we're kicking it off with the Necropolis faction. This is one of my favorite factions, and I know there's a bunch of you Necro fans out there. Now, the purpose of this guide is just to help inform your decision making. I'm going to be giving my thoughts and opinions on each of the upgrade options and trying to weigh the pros and cons. I think the devs have done a really good job of balancing them, so there's very rarely just going to be a strictly better option. You're going to have to just kind of decide what is suitable for you based on your playstyle and the current game state. But I'm going to move straight into it. So remember, if you enjoyed this content, like, comment, and subscribe really helps support the channel a lot. Let's see what Tier 1 has to offer. Alright, so we're starting off with the skeletons here, and the choice is between the skeleton archers and the warriors. Now, the obvious difference here is that the archers are going to be a ranged unit while the warriors are a melee one. But the other significant difference is in the damage. So these are going to do 1 to 3 damage, while these are going to roll 2 to 3. And while that might not sound like a massive difference because they're both capping out at 3, when you consider that the average here is 2 versus an average of 2.5, that is a 25% difference. And then you've also got to account for all these other stat differences. So we've got more defense, more attack, more initiative on these, and that initiative is especially going to be important. That being said, I still incredibly value the ranged on these guys. I think especially in the early game, I much prefer to go for the archers because they're going to help you clear out all of those neutral stacks without taking too many losses. That's going to allow you to snowball and just keep building up your army without suffering too much attrition. But I think there is a lot of merit in opting for the archers to start with, and then later game, once you start coming up against the enemy players or AI, switching over to the warriors. Now, the biggest problem with the warriors really is their speed. So they're still going to take a long time to lug themselves across the battlefield. But if you do follow that strategy of starting with the archers and then switching to the warriors, then by the late or mid game, you're going to have a lot more buffs and artifacts potentially that are going to increase the speed of your units, which is going to help get them out there into the action a lot faster. And speaking of artifacts, if you are playing Necropolis, definitely keep your eye out for anything that is going to increase your unit damage by even just 1. So something like the War Drum, for example, is going to be really good because having even 1 extra damage on such a low damage roll for your skeletons is going to make a massive difference in the end game, because as a percentage boost, that is huge, and you're going to be able to accrue such large numbers that that extra boost turns these units into a legitimate end game threat. Next up, we're going to compare the Phantasm against the Wraith as an upgrade for our Tier 2 whites, and this is another really interesting one, to be honest. I personally tend to opt for the Phantasms, and the main reason for that is due to their Nightmares passive ability, which is going to do some really good damage over time, and the Necropolis laws do have some buffs for damage over time as well. I think you can get an extra 100% on top of any base damage over time. So as a pure damage dealing unit, I think I prefer the Phantasms, but I can see a very, very strong case to be made for the Wraiths. Now, I think what it's going to come down to is what you want to use these units for. So the reason you might want to go for the Wraith is not thanks to its Howl of the Banshee ability. If anything, that's kind of annoying. I found in my testing, I almost never use this one. The main difference is going to be the Memory Devourer passive, which both of the units have, but you can see that the potency on the Phantasm is a little bit less. So you're only going to get that 20% conversion on the Phantasms, and then you're going to get 40% conversion on the Wraith. So I think if you want a unit that is going to go out there and soak up a bunch of damage for you, that's going to be your choice there. So the idea is you send these guys out there, you attack the enemy, you create your bonus stack, and then you're going to absorb a counterattack, which is really nice because that opens up the attack for all of your other units. And then hopefully the enemy spends the rest of the game just focusing down your bonus stacks instead of your actual units. So they're really nice for that. They do have quite low defense, which is a little bit of a trade-off here. But overall, I think both of these options are going to be great. You can't really go wrong either way. But moving on, we've got the Goddess Boy next, and the choice here is between the Armored Hound and the Barghest. Now, as the name implies, the Armored Hound is going to be the more defensive option, and then you're going to get a little more damage out of the Barghest. This is one that I do flip-flop on quite a lot. I think I've exchanged this unit more than any other unit in the game, just going back and forth between the two, but I think I am finally starting to come down on the side of the Barghest. And the main reason for it is just the increased speed and the increased initiative. I think I value that quite a lot, just getting these guys out there into the fight as fast as possible. But there is a really strong case to be made for the Armored Hound. I think these are still incredibly powerful. I think especially if you have a lot of damage over time effects going on, so you might have the faction lore, you might have a couple of artifacts or something that increase it as well, so that's going to get the most out of this lacerated wound passive. The other nice thing about the Armored Hound is that you don't have to spend any focus charges to get the most out of it, because everything here is just a passive ability, so it's going to be nice and simple. You just send them in, they're going to do their thing, whereas the Barghest has this Call of the Pack special. But the problem with this is that it's really not that good, at least not compared to some of the other abilities on your other units. So you don't really want to be spending your focus charges on this ability when there's so many better things to be doing. So that's kind of wasted a little bit in my opinion, which is one of the major downsides of the Barghest. But overall, I still think I prefer this for my playstyle. I prefer my units to just get out there and do as much damage as possible, but you might play a little bit differently, and therefore you're going to get more value out of the Armored Hound. Looking into the tier 4 next, we're comparing the Kennel Master against the Merchant of Death as an upgrade for the Grave Robbers. And thematically, the main difference between the two is going to be in what they can summon. So as the name implies, the Kennel Master is going to be able to summon the undead pets, whereas the Merchant of Death can summon the skeletons and the wights. Now, overall, I think this one is pretty easy for me. It's probably one of the easiest on the entire roster here. I almost always opt for the Merchants of Death. I think the damage output is just better, and it's mainly thanks to this Blighted Corpses passive, which is going to give you really good damage over time. They also have slightly higher initiative, although their actual damage stat is a little bit lower. That being said, I think the slightly reduced damage stat is well and truly outweighed by the extra damage over time you're going to get from Blighted Corpses. But there is an argument to be made that summoning a tier 3 unit in the pets is better than summoning tier 1 and 2 units, and I have been trying out the Kennel Master more recently to see if I can get more utility out of this Hail ability, but to be honest, I've not been loving it. I always find I'd just rather spend my focus points summoning the pets or just going in for an attack, so for now, I think I'm going to be sticking with the Merchant of Death, but let me know if you disagree. Alright, but we're on to the tier 5, and this is where it starts to get really interesting in my opinion. One of the main reasons for that is because as we get to the higher tier units, the stat differences become a lot more substantial, and that's naturally going to happen because as your stat pool gets bigger, you're going to have more room for variation. So you can see here we've got pretty substantial swings in attack and defense, as well as damage, and then a little bit of a difference in initiative. Now, the choice here is really hard in my opinion because both of these Lich options are fantastic. The Lich is just a really good tier 5 unit. I would actually rate it as the best tier 5 unit across all of the factions that we have so far. And for the longest time, I had just been going with the Sanguine Lich because I think they're incredibly strong. The heal that you get from the Unlife Undeath ability is pretty good. This really isn't the main reason. The Knowledge of Death is a really nice passive to have. Getting that passive XP bonus to just grow your hero's stats a lot faster is going to give you some really good early game tempo, or probably more like mid game tempo because you might not have these units in the early game. But the main reason is because of this Rewind Death ability. This is going to have the potential to just completely change the fate of your battles and bring all of your stacks back. The heal is massive. You can just fully revive stacks of your vampires or whatever it may be. But that being said, one other way to keep your units alive is just to make the enemy units dead. And the Pestilent Lich is going to be very, very good for that. You do get AoE damage. We obviously have stats that are geared for damage. And the Death's Embrace active ability is really nice as well. I've been playing around with this a little bit, and the way I think that you're going to get the most out of it is just to go for a full damage over time setup across the board. So if you've got the Phantasms, you go for the Armored Hounds, and you would go for the Merchant of Death, then you're going to get all of those damage over time effects start stacking up, and then you can set off one of your Death's Embrace for a unit that might have a bunch of those effects stacked on it. However, that's going to be the completely fair and boring way to use that ability. If you really want to break it, then you need to go ahead and get yourself 4 pieces of the Ethereal Knowledge set. So when you have all 4, it's going to read all allied lasting effects from spells and creature abilities have unlimited duration. Now, strictly speaking, it's not actually unlimited. It's a stack of 9,999. So the way that's going to work is whenever you apply any sort of dot damage to the enemy with just a small stack of phantasms, for example, then you're going to get 9,999 stacks of it, and then you can set all of them off with your Lich. So you can pretty much one-shot anything in the game with this. But realistically speaking, this isn't going to be a very reliable strategy because you will have to get incredibly lucky and find all 4 pieces of this really rare armor. But if you do get lucky, then it's worth knowing about and it's fun to theorycraft nonetheless. Moving on to tier 6 next, we're looking at the upgrades for the Death Knight. So we're comparing Avatar of War versus Hollow Reaper. And you can see, at least stats-wise, the Hollowed Reaper is geared a little more for damage, though you do suffer a loss of speed and initiative here, which in my opinion is very impactful. That being said, you can pretty much also ignore these stat increases because the Avatar of War has the double strike ability. So you're going to just hit twice and you are going to end up doing more damage than the Hollow Reaper. But there are some things to be said about the Hollow Reaper. One, it definitely wins in the style points category. I think the Hollow Reaper looks way cooler than the Avatar of War. But it also has this Death Stare ability, which especially in the early game is really strong for taking down tier 7 units. And you can even do some shenanigans where you split these out into stacks of 1 just so that you can get those attacks off and always kill at least 1 tier 7 unit with every attack. So that is a really nice strategy that you can implement with these. And they do have this AoE ability, which is really nice as well, especially when you combine it with the Death Stare. If you are attacking multiple stacks of tier 7 units, it's kind of funny. But overall, the way I like to play these is start off with the Hollow Reapers, and then when your stack sizes start just getting larger anyway, and you're more focused on just the actual damage to kill the enemy units, I switch over to the Avatar of War. And I also think the War Incarnate passive is much more impactful than the Hungering Hollow passive because your stacks aren't going to die and trigger this nearly as often as you're going to get this one triggered from just doing attacks, and it pairs especially well with the double strike ability. So for me, it's Avatar of War in the late game, Hollow Reaper in the early game. But we've got just one more to go. We're looking at tier 7 now, comparing the Vampire Lord against the Vampire Scholar. And once again, I think this one's really just going to come down to the role that you want these guys to fulfill. The Vampire Lords are going to be substantially more aggressive of a unit. I think they're much better for just getting them into the fight. You can see we've got higher speed and initiative, which once again, I value quite a lot. And they're also going to be a little bit tankier. So their tankiness also really is boosted by the Vampirism ability. Both of these are going to have Vampirism, but when you're in there faster, thanks to the higher speed and initiative, that Vampirism really starts paying off earlier because you're going to get in there, get some first strikes going, and then even after you start taking damage, you're just going to counterattack and your units are going to heal back up. But that being said, I think if you want a little more utility and you want the Vampire Scholars to support your Sanguine Liches as a healer on the battlefield, you can get these to a point where the healing between those two units is just insurmountable for some of your enemies. So they're going to have the Blood Transfusion ability, which is going to do a bunch of damage to your opponents and heal one of your other units. And once again, that does revive fallen units, so you get that sort of necromancy effect on those. And you also have a nice damage dealing Corpse Explosion ability, which is going to do some good AoE damage as well as heal your units in the area. And that one can be a little tedious to set up. Like, you really need it to everything to sort of line up and go right for that to work. But in those end game clashes where you get heroes just smashing their full late game armies against one another, you do end up with a lot of units just sort of piled on top of one another. So it can be really good in those scenarios. Now, one thing I am very interested in continuing to test to see if it actually has meaningful results is whether or not the lower HP on the Vampire Scholars can actually be a good thing. And the reason for this is because Necropolis's necromancy ability is all based on HP. So you're going to convert HP loss from your enemy stacks into HP gains for your own stacks. And if your units have lower HP, you're going to get more of them. So I'm wondering if you get better growth out of the necromancy ability on your Vampire Scholars than you do on your Vampire Lords, because I know I found that I really wasn't getting many Vampire Lords from the necromancy ability. So I'm wondering if just running around with a stack of these is going to be better. And then even if you ended up wanting Vampire Lords, you can end up just changing the upgrade for free. So you could get a whole bunch of free growth from the Scholars and then just convert them to Vampire Lords anyway. So I'm wondering if that's low-key a good meta strategy to try and use, or whether or not it's just going to be too much busy work. But nonetheless, if you do end up trying it and you find it's actually impactful, I'd love to hear about it in the comments down below. But that's going to do it for this one. Hopefully that analysis was helpful for you and can inform some of your decision making. Let me know in the comments down below which unit selections you prefer. I'd love to hear from all of you. Otherwise, thank you for watching. I'll catch you next time. Have a good one.